All right. So hello and welcome all. I want to start off by making everyone aware that today's session is being recorded and that the recording will be shared with all registered attendees. My name is Mike Ciaramella. I'm the Seafood Safety and Technology Specialist with New York Sea Grant and Cornell Cooperative Extension, and I'm currently leading a USDA food safety outreach program funded project to develop a hazards and controls guide to support safe seaweed production and marketing. This project was initiated through a seaweed food safety training work group that I've been coordinating for several years now. And this effort is step 2 in our approach to developing a seaweed specific food safety training program. The first step was to develop a regulatory guide for seaweed in the US, which combined with this hazards and controls guide can serve as the foundation for a more formal training program. I'm going to start with a brief introduction and update on the project itself, and then I'll pass the screen to Kathy Janasie with the National Sea Grant Law Center, who will introduce the Seaweed Regulations chapter and previously developed guidance document on how seaweeds are regulated in the US. However, before jumping into that, I want to introduce our core team and authors of this guide, which include Dr. Jennifer Perry, Associate Professor of Food Microbiology at the University of Maine, Dr. Amanda Shore, Assistant Professor of Microbiology at Farmingdale State College, Dr. Brian Himmelblum, Associate Professor of Seafood Microbiology, retired from University of Alaska Fairbanks, Dr. Razia Farzad, Seafood Safety Extension Specialist with Florida Sea Grant and University of Florida, Dr. Christina DeWitt, Professor at Oregon State University Seafood Research and Education Center, Dr. Indu Upadhyaya, Food Safety Assistant Extension Educator with the University of Connecticut, Zachary Gordon, Assistant Extension Educator with Connecticut Sea Grant and University of Connecticut, Anoushka Concepcion, formerly with Connecticut Sea Grant, University of Connecticut, and lastly, Catherine Janasie, who will be presenting shortly and can provide a more formal introduction at that time. Now I'll provide a short update on the project before wrapping up with the next steps and our timeline. We started by creating an outline of the guide, including key chapters and content, as well as assigning lead authors from our core team for each of the proposed chapters. Once those chapters were assigned, authors began to conduct a literature review and draft them. In total, we ended up with 16 chapters and 4 appendices, which largely contain a lot of the data that was collected and pulled from the peer-reviewed articles. The drafted chapters were then shared internally, allowing for our core team to provide additional feedback on the content in preparation for an extensive external review by industry, agency, and academics with knowledge or experience in seaweed processing, regulation, and food safety. In total, we have nearly 30 reviewers lined up, and the draft guide is currently out for review. We've asked reviewers to focus that review on the accuracy of the content within the guide, the accessibility and readability of the language used, as well as the feasibility of actually applying the recommendations that are made throughout that resource. We expect the reviews to be returned by May 1st and plan to dive into incorporating and addressing any of the questions and recommendations made at that time. The team will meet in person to discuss any of these comments that warrant further discussion and finalize the contents and recommendations before moving forward with the final formatting and copy editing. We'll also be working towards the development of cover art and potentially some additional infographics on key topics that were identified through this effort. We hope to have that guide complete and published by September of this year. In addition, we'll be hosting a series of webinars to share and introduce some of the contents of the guide, this being the first, which will focus on seaweed regulations in the US. Our second will be planned for June 18th, which will cover biological hazard chapters in the guide. And the third will plan for a July 11th, which will focus more on the chemical hazards chapters within the resource. Once registration opens for those webinars, anyone who's registered for today's will receive an email with the registration link. And that concludes my update on the project as a whole. So I'll now pass the screen to Kathy with the National Sea Grant Law Center to introduce herself and share more on how seaweed is regulated in the US.
All right. Yes. All right, so hi everyone, I'm Kathy Janasie. I am a research attorney with the National Sea Grant Law Center. And so I've been working on seaweed regulatory issues for quite a few years now with my Sea Grant colleagues. But I wanted to give an overview today of what the chapter in our hazard and control guide is gonna look like. And you'll see as I go through this, it's very heavily federal laws and regulations. And the reason why we're focusing on that is because Instead of the state differences, is we really want to, through this project, do an emphasis on what the federal requirements are. And so I'll highlight in certain places where state regulation is differing from what I'm saying, but we really do want to focus on this federal overview that operations have to meet in the US. So all food in the United States is covered by the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, also known as the FDCEA. And the major component of that act as it applies to food is what's known as the adulteration provision. And so all food that's moving in interstate commerce in the United States have to meet this provision that is saying that food in the United States cannot be prepared, packed, or held under unsanitary conditions. And I will get into more detail about what that, those terms actually mean in a few minutes. But I always like to start here because it is kind of the overarching umbrella of where we are when we're talking about food in the United States. So no matter what I talk about the rest of the time, and if I qualify whether or not seaweed is covered, seaweed's always going to have to meet this adulteration provision if it's moving in interstate commerce in the United States. The other major law that comes into play when we're talking about food safety in the United States is the Food Safety Modernization Act, also known as FSMA. And so Congress passed FSMA in 2011 as a way to strengthen food safety regulation in the US. And it's really meant to prevent food safety issues before they happen, instead of trying to deal with them after the fact. So it really is a law looking at prevention when we're talking about food safety. And very importantly, FSMA is applicable to what's known as a food facility that engages in manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding food for consumption. And so a lot about what I'm going to talk about the rest of my time today is kind of how seaweed really does or does not fit into that definition, and thus the requirements of FSMA and its related rules. So seaweed is considered by the FDA as a raw agricultural commodity. We know that because in February 2021, the FDA responded to a request from the Association of Food and Drug Officials asking how FDA was looking at classifying seaweed, and they replied to that request by saying it's a raw agricultural commodity. These are often referred to it as RACs, and what we're talking about here is food in its raw or natural state. Raw agricultural commodities do not include processed or manufactured food. And so, when we're talking about seaweed as a raw agricultural commodity, we're talking specifically about it in its raw state. And then once it moves through any kind of processing or manufacturing component, it's going to, affect the way that it is regulated in the United States. But importantly, because it is considered a RAC, it's very specifically falling within a certain rule that I will talk about, the preventive control rules, and that seaweed operations are going to have to meet those requirements. So other examples of raw agricultural commodities are what you would think: fruit, vegetables, nuts, eggs, raw milk, meat, grains. So anything that's really in that natural form and hasn't been subject to any additional processing steps, that would make it a processed food. So importantly, because I get this question a lot, the FDA does not consider seaweed to be produce. And that means that seaweed is not covered by the produce safety rule. Specifically, produce is defined in the produce safety rule as a long list of commodities, and algae isn't on it. And specifically, when it was publishing the produce safety rule, FDA actually responded to some specific comments about whether or not they thought algae would be covered. And at that time, the FDA said, no, algae does not fit in this long list of produce that we're considering covered by this rule. But the comment also left open the opportunity that FDA may revisit that classification at some time in the future. But as of this point in time, it is not covered under the produce safety rule. And we have FDA commenting to that effect. So we have pretty good evidence that it's not covered. FDA also does not consider seaweed to be a seafood, which means that the seafood HACCP regulations do not apply. I just put up the fish and fishery product definitions here. And again, seaweed isn't somewhere that's going to fit into those definitions. Seafood HACCP does come into play with state regulation of seaweed. And I'll try to highlight in a couple of places where states have kind of used seafood HACCP to kind of fill the gap in the federal overview. But importantly, the FDA does not consider it to be seafood and is subject to the seafood HACCP requirements. Okay, so I mentioned FSMA, and so its related rules may apply to seaweed. And what I'm going to talk about most of the rest of this webinar is really figuring out kind of when seaweed does and does not fall under FSMA. The rule that we're looking at, since FDA has considered seaweed to be a raw agricultural commodity, is Part 117. Its full title being Current Good Manufacturing Practices, Hazard Analysis, and Risk-Based Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule, often called either Preventive Controls Rule or the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. It potentially applies to seaweed. And so I'm going to go through kind of what I mean when I say that. So seaweed may be exempt from FSMA and the preventive control rules in two different ways. So either it's going to be exempt based on the type of seaweed product that's being produced by an operation, or that operation is going to face modified requirements based on the monetary value of the seaweed product sold. And so we really need to kind of get specific about what kind of seaweed we're producing there. Preventive controls rule and FSMA in general, applies to any operation that manufactures, processes, packs, or holds foods in the United States. Those facilities have to register with FDA, and then as well as when we're talking about a raw agricultural commodity, comply with that preventive control rules. So when we're thinking about whether or not seaweed has to comply with this rule, we're really looking at, is it falling within that definition of facility that's manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding food. So this is just an overview of kind of the requirements when we're talking about the preventive controls for human food rule. And so, all of these apply to food facilities you need to register. And so when I start getting into kind of exemptions or qualified requirements, some of these may or may not be applying, but generally there's good manufacturing practices, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive controls. Subpart D is that modified requirement for qualified facilities, which I'll talk about in a second. Subpart E, has to do with if you're going to be coming out of qualified facility status, as well as record requirements and supply chain requirements as well. But I just wanted to give you all this kind of overview so you know what I'm talking about when I'm saying this rule in general. So the rule is applicable to facilities, but smaller facilities might be known as what is called a qualified facility. And here, seaweed operations, could be falling into this modified requirements based on kind of the size of their operation or how they're selling the products. And we feel like at this point in time, a lot of operations US are going to fall in here. So the first way to be a qualified facility is to be a very small business. And so what this means is a business that grossed less than $1 million a year for the previous 3 years in food sales. FDA guidance says that $1 million cap applies to all food sales for the operation. So what does that mean? I wanted to give you guys some examples so you can know what I'm talking about when I say that. So example one, Seaweed companies never sold more than $800,000 worth of product as a year. That's a very small business and a qualified facility. Example two, the company sells $1 million worth of raw kelp, $200,000 worth of processed seaweed patties. It is not a qualified facility because it's going under that $1 million threshold. And then the final one, if you are a seaweed business who's also selling shellfish and your shellfish operation selling $1.5 million worth of shellfish and then only $200,000 worth of seaweed, you are still not a qualified facility because the FDA is saying you have to aggregate all those food products. And so that is, just some concrete examples of how a business would fall into that first exemption. The second exemption is revolves around what are known as qualified end users. And so these are businesses that have direct sales in the same state within 275 miles to consumers, restaurants, or others that sell food directly to customers. Those food sales have to be less than $500,000 a year and greater than the sale to other purchasers. So obviously this one's a little more complicated than the very small business exemption. So for an example, the seaweed company sells $400,000 worth of blanch kelp to a restaurant in town. It's a qualified facility because all the products are being sold to an end user within 275 miles, and they're selling less than $500,000. And so when we go back and look at kind of those requirements for qualified facilities, really, they're required to do the general provisions, current good manufacturing practices. They're not required to do the hazard analysis and preventive control subpart of the requirements, as well as the supply chain part. And so them falling out of that exemption is kind of creating kind of a regulatory gap where some states are stepping in there and saying, okay, you may be exempt from there, but we're going to step in and say, you have to do seafood HACCP, for example. And the reason why they're doing that usually is because the regulatory agency that's covering the seaweed operation is used to seafood HACCP, and that's why they're using it. But that is why we're seeing kind of in states kind of this inconsistency about some of them requiring seafood HACCP for smaller businesses. And again, as I noted before, one of our goals in creating this guide is to really focus on preventive controls with the hope that these smaller businesses that are falling into these qualified facilities at the moment might be growing and have to transition to having to meet preventive controls in the future. Okay, so the other major way that seaweed can be exempt completely from preventive controls is if the farm is either leaving it in its raw state, so it's still a raw agricultural commodity, or if it's drying the seaweed on the farm without any processing. And specifically for that drying, I'll get into some more concrete examples of kind of how what drying counts and what does not count for that exemption. But for an example, a farm that dries seaweed, that would remain within that definition of farm as long as they are also not cutting or producing a value-added product, such as a salsa. And again, farms are exempt, meaning they don't have to comply with FSMA at all. They're only relying on the FDCA and that adulteration provision. For an example of how some states are handling this exemption under The federal requirements is, for example, Connecticut says, yes, you're exempt under federal requirements, but for raw seaweed, we still want you to go through seafood HACCP. And again, picking seafood HACCP because of the agency who's regulating, that's what they're used to, but not what would be required under federal law if they decide down the line to make some kind of processed seaweed that wouldn't fit within this exemption. So we have two different types of farms under the farm definition. And I wanted to go through them just because whenever I talk about the farm definition and drying, I get questions about kind of where the drying has to come and kind of how the farm operation has to be set up. So there's two types of farms, what's called a primary production farm, as well as a secondary activities farm. And so a primary production farm includes operation under one management in one general but not necessarily contiguous physical location devoted to the growing of crops, the harvesting of crops, the raising of animals, including seafood, or any combination of these activities. In comparison, that secondary activity farm is an operation not located on a primary production farm, devoted to harvesting, such as hulling or shelling, packing or holding of a raw agricultural commodity, provided that the primary production farm that grows, harvests, and raises the commodities owned by the same entity or is jointly owned with a majority interest in the secondary activities farm. So there is some leeway in the definition for harvesting and then drying someplace else, which is why I wanted to focus specifically on those two definitions there. And Alyssa, I see your comment, drying is processing, it is, but it's exempted, as I'm going to talk about in a second. Okay, so raw seaweeds, raw agricultural commodity, it's not covered by FSMA. It still needs to meet the adulteration provision prohibited that seaweed can be handled in a way that's going to make it unsafe to eat. And so the FDCA goes through quite a few ways of what food can be adulterated. And so I'm just going to go through a few of them to give you kind of an example of what we're talking about with adulterated food. So number one, it can't be prepared, packed, or held under unsanitary conditions. So think of food that's been handled in a way that grows bacteria like E. coli or Salmonella, and any way that's going to make it, unsafe to eat. That's prohibited by the FDCA, even if nothing else applies to the raw seaweed under federal law. Food that's containing poisonous or harmful substances that can make people sick is also adulterated food. Food that's filthy, rotting, otherwise unfit to be eaten is another example. Foods with naturally occurring poisonous or harmful substances that exceed regulatory limits are prohibited. And so, think about lead or iodine. If they're exceeding regulatory limits, that would be prohibited under the adulteration provision. These limits don't exist for all food. So we're in a situation now where FDA has not given us limits, say for lead or iodine for seaweed. We have it for other food products like baby food or bottled water, but not seaweed. So for that one, we're still kind of waiting for more federal guidance. And future webinars, as Mike talked about, are going to talk more about some of those hazards we might see in seaweed. And then finally, food that is transported in a way that doesn't comply with the FDA regulations for sanitary transportation practices are also considered adulterated. So raw seaweed, that's all that's applying is those adulteration provisions under federal law. And then depending on the type of food, the producers can use any kind a mechanism to kind of make sure that food's not adulterated. And again, we're focused on FDA preventive controls because that is the one that's applying to seaweed that's processed in the United States. Okay, so getting to dry seaweed. Under a federal law, a farm that dries or dehydrates seaweed on the farm does not need to register under FSMA or the preventive control rules. And so when I'm talking about drying and dehydration, that's what I'm referring to. It is under the definition of processed food. It absolutely is. But under the farm definition, it's getting exempted out of the preventive control rule. And so, that adulteration provision still applies to the dry or dehydrated seaweed. And the state may step in and add additional requirements for that. So for example, last time I was talking to Connecticut, they were talking about maybe
Kathy, you got muted.
Sorry. So for example, last time I was talking about Connecticut regulation, the state was talking about maybe regulating more dry seaweed than is required under federal law. We've asked FDA and they have said that there is no difference to them between whether or not seaweed is dried or dehydrated to fall into this farm exemption. And we also asked if there was any kind of time requirement of when it needed to be dried or to fit within this farm exemption. And again, they replied back that no, there was no temporal requirement for how quickly the seaweed had to be dried for it to fit into this exemption under the farm definition. Nope, wrong way. Okay, and so where this exemption is coming from is farms are allowed to complete harvesting, holding, and manufacturing and processing activities and still meet the farm definition. Drying dehydration is contained within each of those terms. And so that's where this exemption is coming from under the federal regulations, where it's giving the ability for the farm to do these kind of harvesting, holding, manufacturing, processing steps and still meeting that farm exemption. Okay, so all other processed seaweed is regulated under FSMA. That includes seaweed that's dried and dehydrated by an entity other than the farm that grew it. So that's absolutely a processed food, as well as all other types of processed seaweed, such as pickled seaweed, seaweed salsa, anything you can think of that's on the market today is all going to have to go through those FSMA requirements. So they're going to have to register as a facility. And then that question is really whether or not the entity is going to qualify as a qualified facility and meet those modified requirements under the rules. But it's going through that process and requirements as a processed food. So that's all I have for today. I'm happy to answer any questions that people have. Mike, is there anything else you want to step in and add, or you're good?
Well, I think there's one question from Rob. I was just starting to type out an answer, but Rob, based on correspondence with FDA with regards to drying having to be air dried or oven dried, they've told us that air drying or mechanical dehydration both fit within the farm definition as long as it is performed by the farm and there is no further processing outside of that drying. So for example, if you're going to air dry it or oven dry it and then mill it, that's a processed product and that would not fit the farm definition. But if you're just drying that product and then selling it, that fits within the farm definition. And Kathy, correct me if I'm wrong there.
No, that's right. And, besides that, when I was working on this tractor, I actually reached out to our FDA comments. And besides that, guidance that they told us there's no difference between drying and dehydration, and there's no time requirement. We have, the FDA has pretty much said, it all fits.
Mhm. I
It,
think the other thing you need to keep
yeah.
in mind there is this is only if the farm is doing this activity. So if you
Mhm.
sell this to someone else or give it to another facility to do this for you, that is now processing and that is not exempt, right? Because that does not count as a farm activity.
Yeah, exactly right. So it has to be done by the farm who grew it.
Ooh, let's see, comment from Jennifer. According to FDA, it is still under the farm activity. The reduction of the water activity doesn't count, right, at the farm level. That is an exempt processing activity that can be done by a farm. I don't believe there's a specific moisture content level requirement there. There's definitely probably some thresholds you want to reach for safety and quality purposes. And I don't know, Jen, if you want to touch any on that. I know you've been doing some of the dehydration work. I don't know if you have any specific recommendations, but feel free to unmute if you have anything.
Yeah, we don't have specific recommendations for safety particularly, but definitely for quality, the water activity that's seeming to work best for people is about 0.6 to 0.7.
Okay, thanks, Jen. And Alyssa, so there's no oversight of the drying process or any rules about how it must be done. Aside from the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, making sure that you're producing a safe product, there are no specific requirements for the raw seaweeds and the farm level activities. So it's really left up to the producer to identify what are the hazards and how are you effectively controlling them. And you can do that in any way that works for your facility and effectively controls those hazards. But no, there are no specific requirements on the federal level for how that is done and what specifically must be done. Some states may have more specific guidance. I know in New York, we do not have anything currently. We did create a New York specific guide with the New York Sea Grant to help the industry, creating some thresholds based on published tolerance intakes for various potential contaminants that we know to be an issue in seaweeds. But as far as federal requirements, no. And feel free to unmute too if you have questions or raise your hand. All right, so the farmer is renting a space at a public kitchen. Does that count as the farmer doing the drying? Kathy, do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, and so that would be getting into whether or not it would fit into that secondary production farm definition. And so that's saying someplace that's not located on the primary production farm, provided that they're growing that and that they own or jointly own a majority interest in the secondary activities farm. And so I would think based on that, no. But next time I will speak to FDA, I could ask them that specifically. But my gut instinct would be no.
Okay. And then I don't know, Kathy, if you have the specific correspondence where, well, I don't think they reference specific water activities at all in any of the
No, they don't.
correspondences, but they do exempt the activity of drying on a farm, which inherently is going to reduce that water activity. So that's kind of just implied in that exemption, I would say, but I don't think they explicitly say you can reduce water activity, creating a distinct commodity. That's okay at a farm level.
Yeah, no. And then going back, let me go back to sharing real quick. Because, let's see if I can get there. And so, that manufacturing processing does allow for creating a distinct commodity. So the example FDA gave us when they, presented to, Sea Grant people, a couple of years ago, was, the idea from a grape to raisin. So the regulations themselves allow for creating a distinct commodity, but as Mike says, we don't have really any guidance from FDA except very general guidance through communications with them. And so nothing in the regulations or anything that's really getting that specific.
So hang on, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm sorry, this is Janasie from Connecticut. Can you bring that slide up that you just had again, showing
Sure.
the difference in the drying activities? Because the way that it has been explained to us, and the way that I read, it, is that dehydrating would reduce the definition of what makes a new commodity would be the water content. That is what we have been told by multiple of our agencies, not just ourselves. And I believe that when FDA is okaying drying activities, they do not realize that the drying activities that they're considering farm activities are bringing the water content or the water activity down by that much. It says manufacturing and processing is more what that type of drying activity. It is creating a distinct commodity.
Mm-hmm. And they do consider grapes to raisins to be a farm activity.
Yeah,
But it
so
says that is what's considered manufacturing and processing.
But yeah, let me clarify. The farm definition itself says harvesting, holding, and certain manufacturing processing that's happening on the farm is included within the farm definition. So yes, it's manufacturing processing, but those specific activities are included within the farm definition, and makes it an exempt activity where they don't need to register. And when FDA has spoken to us previously about seaweed being dried, they specifically, pointed to that grapes to raisin example of an activity that would still be exempted.
How is that possible? That I just don't I do not believe that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, so that I think would be a question for FDA because that's explicitly in their definitions of a farm and what they constitute or classify as a farm. And they do allow for that creation of that distinct commodity under certain circumstances, like the grape to raisin, which also applies to our seaweeds where you're doing it.
So who are you speaking with at FDA? Because I haven't been able to find anybody who's willing to help.
Yeah, so the FDA we've been with is Emmanuel Hignett. And so FDA doesn't really have a lot of people on seaweed. And so it's definitely something we're waiting for more guidance on this for sure. Because I'm getting questions like you're asking me all the time.
Yeah. I do not believe that is correct. I believe whoever is giving you that, the way that it has been explained to us is that once you cross that water activity threshold, it is processing. It can be done on the farm, but it's no longer under that umbrella. You now need separate controls to make sure that you are getting it under a water activity that will not allow bacterial growth.
And I'll say that example is in the FDA regulations as well. So that what I have there on this slide is not from that email, it's directly from the FDA regulation.
Right, but if I'm producing grapes, I have to I mean raisins, I must have to get it, there must have to be controls. I must have to get the raisins down to a certain water activity or some standard of dehydration, because if you don't, then you will have bacteria growth. So there does have to be some kind of guidance as to what is acceptable when you are dehydrating or drying.
So, and some of that might come down the line with the buyers, right? And they'll be the ones responsible for sourcing and ensuring there are sourcing requirements. So they might be the ones setting those requirements. in terms of making sure the products they're sourcing are safe, just like we have with the seafood HACCP regulation and exemptions for fishermen. There are a lot of things that can go wrong and cause issues on a fishing vessel or on an aquaculture operation, but those entities are exempt from the seafood HACCP regulation and do not have to have HACCP plans or comply. However, the buyers, right, are sourcing from those entities as primary processors are responsible for ensuring that anything that happens on that farm or on that vessel is not rendering that seafood, that product, unsafe. So it might be, and that's where that is coming into play. And that's why the FDA does not have any strict requirements around that farm level activity, because they're expecting it to be controlled by that primary processor.
Yeah, and then watching, the chat and Christina, what you're putting in, it's meeting the farm definition. They're not under FSMA at all. And it's that FDECA, which is why, for example, Connecticut stepped in with raw seaweed and required HACCP on the state level to kind of fill that gap. And then go ahead, Mike.
Well, I was just saying, and it sounds like maybe we can see if we can, it's hard to get FDA on virtual or public meetings at the moment, but eventually get them on for a more thorough discussion around the topic. But as of right now, that's pulled right from the FDA definition, and that is a farm level activity that is allowed. And like we said, there's a lot of gray area, especially with the seaweed space in terms of the raw product.
Can I just add that I think my interpretation of it is that the drying is not to produce a shelf-stable product, what's allowed on farm. It's to extend shelf life, but in a product that would still be sold as a raw agricultural commodity. So that's distinct from actually producing a finished product that would be considered RTE as a dehydrated product.
So I do see there's some more questions coming in. Alyssa asked about grapes exposed to things like birds, rodents, and weather. I'm not very familiar with the process of dehydrating grapes, but just like we stated with the seaweeds, they are still subject to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, ensuring safety of that product, and it's not adulterated. If they are coming into contact with birds, rodents, and potentially weather, that could render them adulterated. So likely
my question would be who is in charge of oversight to ensure that that's not happening? That's my question.
I would imagine a lot of that often falls on the states.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's, so all right, that's understandable then. It's sort of the way you guys were talking, it sort of sounded like it's a free-for-all, so I was getting a little concerned, but
Yeah.
as long as we have the purview to do what we need to do on our end, because self-regulation makes me nervous as a regulator. So
yeah, no, and anytime I'm talking, I tried to note it on a couple of slides, but anytime I said like it's not fitting within something, there's always the room for the state to step in and regulate and making sure it's safe.
All right. And then we had another question from Jessica. Any states requiring lead, iodine, etc. testing? So most states, many states have requirements for testing, I believe, but specifically what, and there aren't specific thresholds stated for seaweed specifically. So there are some French for some commodities. We've created some guidance for New York in terms of thresholds that could be utilized. But ultimately, they're not, again, it's coming back to the very general requirements of making sure your foods are safe and not explicitly saying exactly what you have to do to ensure that.
we found some disturbing levels of heavy metal contamination in the dried product in Connecticut. However, we don't really have a statistically significant data set because, we're really limited in what we can do in testing, but the dried seaweed causes us a lot of concern. It's based on, preliminary testing. And we do test the raw product too. We don't really find any issues with that at all, honestly, but we still are continuing to do it for the time being. And I do know that our growers are looking into the iodine content, but that's something they're doing on their own here in Connecticut. So
Yep, and the guide that's coming out, we'll have a whole chapter on iodine, providing some additional insights into that. But the bottom line is iodine, it's kind of up in the air. Is it good? Is it bad? Well, it can be good to some extent, but some species, especially kelp, have extremely high iodine concentrations. And so, I mean, best approach we've seen from the literature is making sure you're properly labeling those products to make sure that anybody that potentially has thyroid issues who could experience adverse health conditions when consuming high levels of iodine is aware of those high concentrations if you're developing products with them in it. I see Sam's got a question about the term farm and applying to farmer cooperatives. So co-op owned, if a farmer co-op owned a dryer, would it consider exempt if used by any and all farmers? I think based on what Kathy said earlier, if they are all owners of that facility and operation, that would still count as a farm activity.
Yeah, with the jointly owned. But again, like getting back to Rob's and Sam's, yeah, that's what I would think based reading the regulation. Definitely something we could ask FDA explicitly in the future, kind of those different examples you guys are giving.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of the challenge around this, and I think we're hearing it from the states who are participating today, is that there's very little federal involvement in this activity because most of the producers are such small scale producers. So there's very little federal regulation coming into play. And so, and that's been a challenge for us in trying to provide guidance and develop trainings and resources in what Kathy mentioned earlier with this kind of straddling two different regulations, seafood HACCP versus the federal Food Safety and Modernization Act's preventive controls rule. Because it's subject to preventive controls, but many states predate the designation as a raw agricultural commodity. They already were regulating under HACCP, right? So they already have these established HACCP systems and programs for regulating seaweeds. But trying to create a training program that's going to support the industry and prepare them for growth, you know, we're trying to do that in a way where we can still accommodate the fact that some are operating and utilizing this HACCP system, but may potentially need to transition into the preventive controls type of food system. So that's been a little bit of a challenge, and I think there's a lot of gray area, and a lot of that is falling on the states just because of the small size of this emerging industry right now. I know that we're struggling with that here in New York. And I'd also welcome, especially state participants, if you want to be more engaged in conversations with other states, to reach out to me. We do have our outside of this core group developing this document, we have our the work group that I talked about developing the training program. So we do regularly meet quarterly right now to have discussions around this, so you can maybe get some more discussions across state lines that might help to clarify and at least can create some level of consistency in how the different states are regulating and working on these challenges.
Yeah, no, thank you all for being on and asking all these questions, because it helps us work through kind of what we're having in the chapter as well.
We do still have a little time for questions if there are any more questions. Right, so I am going to send a link to evaluation in the chat. So please do fill that out. Let us know your thoughts about today's session. Also, feel free to give us some insights into what you might want to see or hear more about in the future. And I'm going to stop the recording. And if there's any questions that you really want to ask that you didn't want recorded,